Good evening. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Dan Schnur Political Report. Tonight's topic is Russia, China, and Iran. And as all you know, we'll have our Q&A portion in about 35 minutes. So just type in your questions for Dan in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Hey, Dan, come join me on screen. This is a fabulous topic, and you need every second to devote to this. So please take it away.
Well, thank you, Kim. It's good to be back with all of you, as always. And as Kim mentioned, I feel like because we've spent so much time over the course of the fall, understandably talking about domestic American politics, that we've decided it was a good idea by the end of the year to shift back to an international focus before we wind up 2022 and head into 2023. With the election over, Biden, well, almost over, we'll know in a few hours or a few days what the result of the Georgia Senate race is. But with the election largely over, I should say, President Biden and the new Congress are still going to face many difficult challenges on the world stage. And while there is certainly no shortage of international challenges for them to confront, and we'll talk about more of them over the course of the year, we'll talk about Israel and the Middle East, we'll talk about Latin America, we'll talk about Africa. We've, believe me, no shortage to get us through another calendar year of these conversations. But we decided that rather than trying to boil the ocean tonight, we'd start out with what I think are the three most significant looming challenges for the US and the global order, those being Russia and China and Iran. But of course, as always, as Kim mentioned, once we get to the bottom of the hour, once we get to 5:30 Pacific time, I'll be more than happy with Rachel's able help to address questions on any other topics that any of you would like to discuss, either other international issues or domestic policy and domestic politics as well, because there's certainly no shortage of post-election news in this country that we can discuss. But we've got a whole year to get to that. So tonight, let's talk about these three most significant international challenges for the US and its allies. So there's, as a framework for the discussion of the war in Ukraine, I'm going to offer you an old saying I'd heard years and years ago to describe how the news media covers news locally, nationally, and internationally. And the way the saying goes with public relations pros is they say, you're never going to see stories on the TV news about all the planes that landed at LAX safely, which is true, because if you think about it, the overwhelming majority of commercial aircraft land safely every day, thousands and thousands of flights. Just a tiny, tiny number don't. But of course, it's those that don't that by definition are news and attract a disproportionate amount of the coverage. So what that means, not just when it relates to an immediate potential crisis like an airline crash, but the types of global challenges that we're talking about. Good news, success stories, crises either averted or minimized don't get nearly the attention that they ought to. And so I would suggest to all of you that the most significant, the greatest underreported story of 2022 by the global news media is the success that the US and our allies have had in developing and in maintaining the alliance versus Russia in support of Ukraine. From the very beginning, as we've talked about many, many times over the last several months, from the very beginning, Vladimir Putin's gamble, the core of his strategy was that as time passed, once he invaded Ukraine, that as time passed, that US voters and voters in other Western democracies would get bored or they'd get distracted. They'd simply stop paying attention to the war in Ukraine. And even if there was a great fervor of support for Ukraine and against Putin and Russia at the outset, Putin gambled that as time passed, that support would weaken, and that Putin could help weaken it by imposing some types of uncomfortable challenges on the West going forward. But here we are, 9 months into this war, and even given the spikes in gasoline prices that we've seen in this country and elsewhere over the course of the year, even given the other types of even more significant energy-related discomfort that many citizens of European countries are now facing, will be facing over the winter, for the most part, the coalition is holding. And that can't help but to be encouraging. But Putin, if you watch him closely, still hasn't given up on his original bet. If anything, in fact, he's doubled down on it. And what he is hoping for, what he's pushing for, is over the course of the winter, not only will Europeans, not only will Americans, but the Ukraine citizens will simply become fatigued, at which point the advantage will switch again in his favor. So before we go any further, I'm going to ask Katie to put up the first question of the night for all of you. And what I want to do for a group of extremely interested individuals is get a sense as to whether your fatigue is kicked in at this point. So first question for all of us: how long should, emphasize should, not how long do you predict, but how long do you believe the United States and our allies should continue to support Ukraine? And I should clarify, by support Ukraine, I mean continue to provide them with very large amounts of military and other types of financial assistance. So not direct military engagement, but the type of support that we've been providing for the last several months. How much longer should that continue? For another 3 to 6 months? For another 6 months to a year? For another 1 to 5 years? Or alternatively, as long as it takes, if for the foreseeable future and beyond, it's going to require a sustained financial effort to support Ukraine military and in other ways, that's something that our country and our allies need to do. What do you think? Answer the first question. How do we do, Katie? Wow. Now that is one resolute group that we have here. 89%, that even if it takes more than 5 years, the United States should continue to stand with Ukraine, not just politically, but financially. 6% say 1 to 5 years, and even smaller numbers would reduce that support in less than a year. So that's us. That's a group of people who pay a tremendous amount of attention to these type of issues. And just to butter you all up a little bit, are very well informed, very well educated, and therefore, I think I would be in agreement with you. We understand the important role that the continued survival of Ukraine plays, not just for that country and its people, but on a much, much broader scale. But in other ways, while Putin's gamble has not paid off, there are some signs that his original supposition might have had some legitimacy underneath it. In other words, we're beginning here and there to see some cracks in that originally very strong level of resolute support for the country of Ukraine and for the Ukrainian people. I'll give you a couple of examples. So just this week, a couple of days ago, this nation of Germany announced that they were in fact not going to abide by the commitment they made at the beginning of the war when they agreed to increase their country's military spending for NATO in order to reach that 2% threshold that every NATO country is obligated to provide for the common defense of Europe. You may remember right after the hostilities started, as the coalition came together in a very strong and firm way, their leaders said, not only are we going to stand by Ukraine with the rest of the Western Alliance, but we're actually going to increase our military commitment to NATO. Well, now it looks like that's not going to happen. Not next year, probably not the year after. And beyond that, according to the country's leaders, it's an open question. So you see a little bit of fatigue on the part of European countries. You see squabbling in other European governments as well. Here in this country, as most of you know, not too long ago, when the House Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy, was asked about U.S. support for Ukraine. He said that he and his caucus were not interested in providing a, quote, blank check, unquote, to Ukraine. And while Mitch McConnell and Mitt Romney and other more traditional conservative leaders made it clear that the U.S. would continue to stand with Ukraine, it's becoming fairly clear that McCarthy is speaking for a growing number of people in the House caucus, who, of course, achieved a House majority in last month's elections. And of course, on the other side of the aisle, the House Progressive Caucus sent a letter to Joe Biden urging the United States to encourage Ukraine to begin talks with Putin and his government about a ceasefire. And such was the dust-up over that letter that, in fact, it was formally withdrawn. So in both the far right and far left in this country, you're beginning to see some rumblings. Elon Musk, in between his various preoccupations with Twitter, has also called for negotiations to begin settlement negotiations to begin between Ukraine and Russia. So we're starting to see pockets of this here and there, but on a broader basis, rather than on these in terms of these more isolated incidents. On a broader basis, I'm looking at new polling information that just came out this week in a Washington Post article, if you want to see it, from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And what the Chicago Council's polls showed on Ukrainian issues was the following. The good news is it showed that a strong majority of Americans still want to continue to support sending arms and economic aid to Ukraine. More than 2/3 of the respondents said that the U.S. should be supplying Ukraine with weapons and economic assistance. And even more encouraging, roughly 3/4 supported accepting additional numbers of Ukrainian refugees and sanctioning Russia. So that's the good news. But the respondents, Americans were divided over whether Russia should urge Ukraine to reach a peace settlement with Russia, as Elon Musk has suggested, as that withdrawn House Progressive Caucus letter had indicated. 40% said that the U.S. should continue its current level of support to Ukraine indefinitely. 40%. Remember that our group had an 89% answer to that question. So among a broader American public that doesn't pay nearly as much attention to these issues as most of you do, only 40% said the U.S. should continue to support the levels of support to Ukraine indefinitely, or as we asked it, as long as it takes. Now, let's get a little bit of historical perspective here. In July, 58% of American respondents said the U.S. should help Ukraine for as long as it takes, even if it meant higher gas and food prices for American consumers. Now 40% say we ought to continue that level of support indefinitely. So that's not a dangerous level, but it's a level that we ought to keep in mind because it's shrinking, and it has been shrinking gradually over the course of the calendar year. There's an old saying when it comes to more traditional U.S. military engagement, whereas this one, of course, is more by proxy. They say that a president is never more popular again than he was on the first day of the war. And that's because that initial burst of enthusiasm, that rally around the flag effect, does tend to elevate the president in terms of public approval ratings and favorability, and then it gradually dissipates. Well, even in a proxy war, we're beginning to see the same thing. So going back to the question I asked a little earlier that Katie posted, that last question was, how long do you think the U.S. and our allies should continue to support Ukraine? Let's put up a slightly different twist to that question if we can, Katie. Can we post our second question? Question 2, not how long should the U.S. and our allies, but this is a predictive question. How long do you believe the United States and our allies will continue to support Ukraine with the type of financial and military assistance I've described? Do you think it'll be for 3 or 6 more months before some kind of reduction comes? Do you think it'll be 6 to 12 months, a year? Do you think it'll be 1 to 5 years? Or do you think the American public will come around and follow your leadership and say, you know what? We are in this for as long as it takes. So answer to the second question. We know how long you all think the U.S. should continue to support Ukraine financially and militarily. Katie, let's put up our second answer. find out what our group thinks, how long will the U.S. continue to support? Look at that drop off. The 3 to 6 more months is still minuscule, just 3%. The 12 months, 1 year of continued support has now leapt from the low single digits up to 23%. That's a 20% increase between what we believe the U.S. and our allies should do and what public opinion will lead us to do. 52% say between a year and 5 years. And it's hard to predict out that far, but that's still interesting guidance. But compared to the 89% of you that said that we should stay there as long as it takes, only 22% believe that the U.S. and our allies will stay there as long as it takes to succeed. Very interesting. Now, as all of you have read, the war has taken all sorts of twists and turns, even since the last time we gathered back last month to talk about the U.S. elections. Over the last weeks, Ukraine, of course, has successfully retaken massive amounts of territory in that country's east. But at the same time, Russia has dramatically escalated missile strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure, most notably on the country's power grid and water delivery systems. So for extended periods of time, millions and millions of Ukrainians have been without water, without power, without food, without internet access, causing a huge amount of human distress and discomfort there, to a point where, for those of you who have not seen it, we're beginning to see calls for a 21st century version of a Berlin airlift to the people of Ukraine. For you students of history, you know, of course, that in the early stages of the Cold War, the US and its allies ran nonstop airlifts into East Berlin, into other parts of East Germany, to provide the citizens of that country with the sustenance they needed in the face of that early Soviet aggression. And now we're beginning to see calls for the US and allies, in addition to the economic and military support already being provided, to mount the same kind of airlifts. Now, I wasn't around for the Berlin airlifts in the 1940s, and I know that most of you weren't either. But what I've read about them is just extraordinary. Because what I'd always thought was, well, that's nice. We send food and blankets to East Germany, or to West Berlin and into West Germany. Wasn't that a good thing to do? But in fact, Western transports, US and its allies were sending planes and helicopters that were landing in West Berlin and other parts of West Germany on the average of every 90 seconds for weeks and weeks and weeks, in order to provide the German people with the material support and comfort that they needed. And I suspect as the winter worsens in Ukraine, we might begin to see a heightened call for a similar type of effort there, which on one hand might be a humanitarian necessity, which on the other hand could really end up causing an even further drop in the type of public support for the war that we were just discussing a moment ago. Now, in recent days, just in the last 48 hours or so, there were reports that Ukrainians have either acquired or begun utilizing for the first time long-range missiles of their own, and striking Russian military targets hundreds of miles behind the front lines of battle. And that was clearly something that Russia has not been prepared for. But with winter coming, the fear is growing that Russia will use the bad weather that area of that region is going to experience for the next months, that Russia is going to use that bad weather as cover to regroup, to retrain its massive influx of new troops, and to dig in and be much better prepared in spring to defend against further Ukrainian progress. So all sorts of things going on over there at all sorts of different levels. I guess what I'd like to do before we move on to our next topic is ask you just a more general question. And Katie, if you can post this for us. What do you think will be the final outcome of the war, whenever that is? Whether it's soon, whether it's later, when the war has ended, when those hostilities have concluded, do you think that Russia will have withdrawn from Ukraine completely, including from the parts, the portions of the country that it occupied previously to this year? Do you see a complete Russian withdrawal? Option two, would you say that Ukraine survives, but that Russia continues to occupy large portions of that country? Or third, do you think as time passes that the tides will turn and that Russia at some point will defeat Ukraine and fully occupy that country? So what did our group have to say, Katie, on that question? 76%, more than 3/4, believe that there will be some kind of compromise. And if you put together the different things we've been talking about for the first portion of this program, what that suggests is that a lot of us believe that while pressuring Ukraine to the negotiating table is not something many of us find attractive, that it looks like it's going to be somewhat unavoidable, because what it would require for the 23% of us who believe that Russia will withdraw from Ukraine completely, what it's going to require for that to happen is a much, much more sustained and intensified military effort. And so based on the 76% of you who believe that Russia will continue to occupy large portions of Ukraine even after the fighting is ended, it looks like at a certain point, Western supporters of Ukraine are going to end up gently or not so gently pushing them to the bargaining table. Now, this leads us into a discussion of the world's other great geopolitical challenge, and that, of course, is China. Now, even before we talk about human rights and military aggression and other of the more red letter issues on the Pacific Rim, let's start out with a brief overview of the economic challenges that China is now facing. Because right now there are serious problems in China's economy. We're seeing another COVID lockdown, of course, and related unrest, which seems to be leading the Chinese authorities to back off just a little bit on their historically very, very, very stringent crackdown and quarantine policies. But that COVID lockdown is causing another downturn, not only in the Chinese economy, but with global chain issues around the world. Of course, as was the case before COVID, China has a rapidly aging population, which is going to make it harder and harder for that country to fill its workforce needs. And that's something that's already begun to be seen in manufacturing and construction and agriculture and other, for lack of a better term, human-intensive economic sectors. But at the same time, they're now seeing greater challenges in technology and real estate, and even in their service and hospitality industries for some COVID-related reasons, for other reasons. So China's economy is clearly weakened, and we'll talk about the geopolitical ramifications of that in just a moment. But before I do, let's come right back to Katie with another question, a broader question for all of you as it relates to China's future. What do you think, given these growing economic challenges relating to COVID, relating to the aging population, relating to the other types of economic difficulties that I mentioned? What do you think best describes China's future? Do you believe, as a growing number of world observers do, that in the not too distant future, China will be the sole dominant world power? Do you believe, alternatively, that China and the US will continue to compete as dual superpowers, with neither one or the other having a significant or visible advantage over the other? Or third, do you believe that China's global influence will fade over time, either because of these economic questions or for other reasons? And Katie, what did we see on this one? What kind of responses did we get? Pretty status quo on this one, our group seems to be. 84% believe that even though there might be, and we'll have to dig into this deeper in January, even though there will certainly be recalibrations along the way, that the US and China will continue to compete and continue to jockey for supremacy on a world stage without either one achieving a clear advantage. 12% believe that China's global influence will fade over time, either because of those economic challenges or for other reasons. 4% of you believe that in spite of those challenges, as China continues to build and continues to assert itself, 4% of us believe that China will be the sole dominant world power. And that's something we'll certainly have to dig into to a much greater degree in a future webinar. And Rachel and Katie, maybe you can remember for early 2023, maybe we want to do one of our monthly programs just on China, so we can look into not just economic issues, but human rights and foreign policy and national security matters as well, and really do the kind of broad and deep overview on these matters that our audience deserves. In the meantime, though, because we began today's conversation talking about Ukraine and Russia, I will reference that comparisons are often made to the challenge the United States now faces with China to the challenges we faced for much of the second half of the 20th century with the Soviet Union. More and more observers refer to the competition the US faces with China as the new Cold War. But there are important differences, because even though we now find ourselves in a bipolar global landscape, just like we were vis-a-vis the Soviet Union in the second half of the 20th century, the biggest differences are not militarily but economic. Because while the Soviet Union was a military power, it was also economically irrelevant for all practical purposes on the world stage. China, of course, is a global economic power, continuing to assert and continuing to grow and to spread its influence. For those of you who did not see it, China's leader were in Saudi Arabia this week, meeting with Arab and Gulf leaders to further their economic ties in that part of the world. So the economic competition, combined with the security and geopolitical competition that we saw during the Cold War, makes this a much, much greater and more complicated challenge. So the US and our allies are going to have to find a way to confront China on military and human rights issues, but without triggering a worldwide economic catastrophe. And so this leads into another key part of the discussion, which is the European Union's approach to China. Now, as we talked about earlier, the United States and the EU have been almost completely in sync. They've been marching virtually in lockstep on Russia and Ukraine. But the relationship and their respective approaches to China have been a lot more complicated, given Europe's own economic interests on the Pacific Rim. And for those of you who did not see it, it was early last month, right after the US elections. NATO's chief, Jens Stoltenberg, gave a really, really interesting speech in which he talked about the differences and the similarities between the Russia and the China challenges. And Stoltenberg was not talking about the Soviet Union. He's talking about Russia today in the run-up to the Ukraine war. And what Stoltenberg said is he made it clear, he said, look, I believe in free trade, and I believe that our member states should continue to trade with China. But, and this is really interesting, this is really important, Stoltenberg made it clear that even though while he understood that European Union countries could and should continue to trade with China, he said, quote, we cannot make these decisions based only on commercial considerations. So this is the Secretary General of NATO saying, we cannot make these trade decisions. We cannot make these decisions based only on commercial considerations. And the point he was making is he said, as we prepared for war with Russia, our economic and energy dependence on them, on Russia, created real hazards for our mutual security. And because we are so dependent on resources from an authoritarian regime like Russia, that made us vulnerable and put us in a less than ideal situation in order to begin the defense of Ukraine. He said, we can't repeat that mistake with China. We need to assess our vulnerabilities, Stoltenberg said. We need to assess our dependence on China and reduce them. So if some type of security challenge or military engagement does arise, that the West is not nearly as compromised going into that type of confrontation as it has been in Eastern Europe. Now, going back to the point I was making earlier, as the Chinese economy weakens, Chinese leaders become more aggressive internationally in order to keep their own public unified and possibly distracted. In other words, if the economy is struggling in China, if an increased number of residents of that country are frustrated by the COVID restrictions, focusing their attention and their anger on an external threat is very smart politics that's been employed in the past, not only in China and Russia, but in the United States and other Western democracies as well. And so while that distraction, while that international refocus has manifested itself on a lot of fronts, where it's been most notable, of course, is in China's increasingly aggressive statements and actions as it relates to Taiwan. And we can talk more about this in the Q&A if you like, because I see we're coming up on the bottom of the hour. But as Russia talks a tougher and tougher game on Taiwan, as they moved more aggressively in the wake of Nancy Pelosi's visit earlier this year, at the same time, China's relationship with Russia has been under real strain. You may remember that right before the Ukraine war started, Russia and Chinese leaders proclaimed themselves as lifelong allies. It has become very clear that China is not happy with what they've seen in Ukraine. And while they've maintained their partnership with Russia and have continued to engage in joint military exercises with China, between China, Russia, and Iran, for that matter, China's leaders have been, say, much more measured in their comments about the Ukraine war. It's clear that they are very concerned with what they see there. So on one hand, if you're China, you think to yourself, given our own problems, we need to focus our people's attention on a supposed external threat, that being Taiwan. On the other hand, they see the West holding together in a much more unified fashion than most would have predicted in support of Ukraine, and worry and wonder if the West will mount the same type of unified presence in support of Taiwan should China move more aggressively in that action. So the question I have for all of you, and Katie, let's make this the last question of the opening, because I do want to go to our group's questions and comments. Let's put up our fifth question, though. And I'll ask, how do you think the Ukraine war, how does the Ukraine war affect a possible Chinese aggression versus Taiwan? Does the war make aggression more likely because of the Chinese need to distract its populace, and because they believe that the US and West are distracted by Ukraine and are not in a position to take on two military confrontations on opposite sides of the world at the same time? So does it become more likely that China moves toward Iran? Does it become less likely because they see the unity that the US and the West are displaying in the face of Russian aggression? Or do the two balance out and does not really make much of a difference? So let's see how we did on that last question. Okay. Really, really interesting. Much more of a split decision than we've seen on most of our questions today. 49%, a little bit less than half of you, believe that China would be less likely to move aggressively at Taiwan as a result of the Ukraine war. Only 17% believe it would make them more likely to, and 34% say no difference. So look, what I realize as we sit 33 minutes into the hour is, unfortunately, we have not gotten to a conversation about Iran as I intended. So that too is something we're going to have to focus on and set aside one of our programs on for early 2023. But of course, if any of you have questions or observations to offer about the recent extraordinary events in Iran between now and the end of our program today, I'd be more than happy to address them also. But at least in terms of the deeper dive, that's going to have to wait for another time. So I'm going to ask Rachel to join me if she'd be willing. And then we can go on to what I think all of you know is my favorite part of the question, or my favorite part of the program. And Rachel, let's get to our group's questions and comments. What do you say?
I think that sounds great. And we have a lot of great ones coming in. So I'm just going to jump right in. On the topic of Russia, one of our audience members asked, regarding the Russian oil price cap, won't lowering the price paid for Russian oil result in a higher volume being sold? So won't other countries outside of the Western coalition go to the lowest price seller? Could this result in Russia selling more oil than at world market prices?
Well, the honest answer is we don't know. When the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and her colleagues in other Western countries came up with the concept of not a full embargo on Russian oil, but rather imposing a cap on how much they'd be willing to pay for it, that was an unprecedented concept or at least even if it had been theorized before, it had never been implemented. So the truth is this has never been done before, and we don't know what the impact is going to be. What I will say, though, Rachel, is despite the West's best efforts to compromise Russia's economy by depriving it of oil markets, it does appear that the more the West withdraws from Russian oil purchases, other countries, China, India, and others, increase their purchases because, as the questioner suggested, those prices become lower. What India's leaders have made clear is they're trying not to take sides in a West versus Russia, US conflict. They're simply saying, we have tremendous energy needs in our country, and Russia's now willing to sell us oil for much less money. So it would be foolish of us not to purchase it. We don't know what the price caps will lead to, but it is entirely possible that Russia will find other buyers for its oil. What I will say quickly, though, before we go on to the next question, is while Russia's oil and energy industries do seem to be doing just fine, even in spite of the Western actions on this front, there are increasing signs that Russia's broader economy is really suffering. Factories are shutting down, workplaces are closing. One of the biggest challenges that Russia has is it requires through the West for replacement parts for most of its machinery, either factory machinery or automobiles or anything else. And in the absence of those parts being available, larger and larger numbers of Russians are simply being told to stay home from work because their workplace can no longer operate. One very smart analysis I saw just over the weekend said that Russia's economy is not dying, but is changing. And what it is changing from is it's changing from an economy based on growth to one based on survival. And the comparison that the author made was comparing the Russian economy to the Iranian economy. Significant natural resources at their disposal, but instead of being able to invest those resources into growing the nation's economy, now they're just struggling to make sure that their people can survive.
So switching gears a little bit, do you think that the amount of time the US supports Ukraine depends on who wins the presidency in 2024?
I think that has the next whoever's the US president in January of 2025 will obviously have a huge impact on all of our foreign policy engagements. But it's already pretty clear that we are beginning to see a partisan breakdown as it relates to Ukraine. And that Republicans generally tend to be much more reluctant to want to continue to provide high levels of support for Ukraine. What we're seeing, there's exceptions to that. Among the most progressive Democrats, who are generally suspicious of any type of US military engagement, the opposition to the war is growing. And generally among the Republican establishment, as I was talking about earlier, the Mitch McConnells, the Mitt Romneys of the world, they're still being very resolute in their support. But if you look at overall poll numbers, you're seeing that Republicans are becoming more reluctant to continue that support. And that drop-off is most noticeable among the Republican voting cohorts that were most supportive of Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020. Though I wouldn't say this about every Republican candidate. I have no idea. I have to admit, I have no idea what Ron DeSantis thinks about Ukraine. I don't think he's said very much about it. But if Donald Trump were the Republican nominee in 2024, not just because of his own history with Ukraine and Russia, of course, but given the shifting sentiments among his base, I think that US support would be very endangered in that case. Now, what I will say is this group's leanings notwithstanding, we are seeing a drop-off in overall political support for the war among the overall voting public in this country. So I don't know the answer to this question, but I'll raise it just for future consideration. If Joe Biden and Donald Trump are running against each other for re-election in just under 2 years, and Joe Biden is a strong supporter of continuing the support for Ukraine, and Donald Trump is an equally virulent opponent, Which one of the two benefits from that difference of opinion politically? And I'm not sure I know the answer to that.
Thanks for that, Dan. We've had a few questions come in about Iran. So does the current unrest in Iran make it more or less likely that the Iran nuclear deal is revitalized?
At this point, I think the Iran nuclear deal is, for all practical purposes, dead and buried. I would say the combination, even 90 days ago, it looked like it'd be much more difficult to resurrect the deal as the Iranians were beginning to demand more concessions. But since then, a couple of big important things have happened. One, of course, we've seen Iran providing immense amount of weaponry and armaments to Russia to allow them to continue the fight in Ukraine. We talked earlier about how the Russian strategy has now shifted to aerial bombings of civilian infrastructure. Well, to a large degree, those bombings are taking place with Iranian missiles. And if you add up the Iranians' overt siding with Russia in the Ukraine war, with the uprisings against the Iranian government since the tragic death of the young woman there a few months ago, I can't imagine a circumstance under which the Biden administration would even participate in serious talks about a nuclear deal, let alone actually achieve the deal. Martin Indyk, the Biden administration's chief representative to the nuclear negotiations, has all but said as much. And while he hasn't declared the talks dead, he's come pretty close to doing so.
Will the uprising of women in Iran change their government's leadership?
It's another question to which we don't know the answer. Most of you probably saw the news this morning that Iran announced that it is getting rid of its so-called morality police, the security force in the nation of Iran that oversees citizen obedience to very strict Muslim law. Women wearing hijabs, other types of reflections of religious observance. Now, there's been some back and forth, some confusion over the last 36 hours or so about whether Iran is actually getting rid of its morality police or not. But to me, it's really interesting that the Iranian government or an Iranian government representative announced that they were. Because whether they actually are getting rid of the security force or not, the fact that they announced it publicly suggests to me that the Iranian government knows that these protests are not going away anytime soon. And unlike the protests of 2009 and 2018 and 19, these have sustained, and in fact, they've grown. And they cut across traditional geographic and ethnic and even religious lines. I don't have any idea on whether these protests can ultimately lead to the removal of the current Iranian regime. It's difficult to see such a thing happening, if only because the country's leaders have done such a good job systematically of eliminating any likely opposition or alternatives over the years. But the fact that an authoritarian government like Iran's makes an announcement, truthful or otherwise, that it's pulling back the security force in order to placate the protesters means, like I said a moment ago, that they know this isn't going away. And they clearly realize they need to do something in order to defuse the protests. I don't think this gesture will, but the fact that the Iranian government thinks that they need to speaks volumes. But what it doesn't tell us is whether the government itself is actually in danger. All it does tell us is that these protests are going to continue. One other point on this, Rachel, because it's such an important point. Every American president of the modern era has faced an Iran crisis, from Jimmy Carter through Joe Biden. And particularly Joe Biden's two most recent predecessors, Barack Obama in 2009 and Donald Trump in 2018 and 2019. They watched an Iranian uprising start, gave it the barest of lip service support, and for any number of reasons decided not to get more forcefully involved. The Biden administration, in my opinion, to their credit, have found other ways to be engaged. They've not only provided much more vocal support to the protesters from a political standpoint, but from a much more practical perspective, the Biden administration has provided a great deal of assistance to try to keep internet communications up and running in that country so the protesters are able to communicate and coordinate with each other. The challenge for Biden is the same as it is for his predecessors. If you were to engage more directly on behalf of the protesters, does it then cause a backlash within Iran? Because, of course, the US government is not particularly popular in that country. But I think the difficulty for Biden to sit and watch if these protesters were to be somehow were to be defeated would be a very difficult thing to sit by and watch passively. And so the test for Biden now is, can you find a way to engage the United States either directly or through intermediaries in a more impactful way than we have to date in order to help the protesters' prospects? Or do we limit our involvement, even if it does in all likelihood lead to the continued survival of the current regime?
Great, thanks, Dan. So moving back to Russia for a minute, has the US frozen enough Russian assets to pay for the rebuilding of Ukraine?
No, and that's not criticism. The US and its allies have frozen an unprecedented amount of Russian assets. But the amount of damage that's been done to Ukraine at this point is almost incalculable. And so while it's tempting to think, well, if we just seize enough of the oligarchs' riches, that'll pay for the rebuilding of Ukraine, it won't even come close. And as expensive as the war effort has been and will continue to be for the foreseeable future, the financial commitment it's going to take from the US and other Western democracies to help rebuild Ukraine is just enormous. And as much as I hate to say it, it's difficult to envision a scenario in which the US and its allies provide anywhere near a sufficient amount of resources for that rebuilding. One country that might, should they choose to, is China, which opens up another branch of the conversation about China's efforts to grow its influence in other parts of the world. And just as they have in Latin America and Africa and the Middle East and elsewhere, it's not difficult to see them pouring a great deal of money into Eastern Europe in order to foster stronger relationships in that part of the world.
Very interesting situation. So our next audience member asked, now that Brittany Griner is in a Russian penal colony and Paul Whelan is still a hostage, is there any urgency to get them out of Russia, and how could we do that?
This is an incredibly difficult challenge for the Biden administration, because you have two prominent Americans being held in Russia, clearly as pawns or as attempted leverage points over the Ukraine war and the US involvement there. And it appears that in order to get these two individuals freed, it would require immense concessions on the part of the United States government. And even if you think those concessions are justified, and there's a debate on both sides of that, there's no way to know in advance whether Russia would not then turn around and simply ask for more. I think Putin understands he has a very, very impactful propaganda tool here, particularly in Brittany Griner. And the Biden administration, while having raised her captivity to a much higher level of public attention than it had been previously the case, it's not the type of thing that's on the news every night. And what Biden and his advisors have to weigh is, if you do raise it to that level of visibility, are you not providing Russia with even greater propaganda opportunity? The Biden administration has already offered a prisoner exchange with some pretty unsavory Putin-allied criminals in U.S. prisons. I don't know enough about the particulars to know how much more they can offer without creating a real security risk. But I do know from a political and PR standpoint that pushing much harder publicly could easily have exactly the opposite of the intended effect and make it even easier for Russia to dig in and score propaganda points, not only on in Eastern Europe, but on the world stage.
So switching gears a little bit, we've had a few questions come in about domestic politics. So one audience member asked, could you take a few moments to reflect on the constitutional suspension that the former president suggested this weekend?
So as I'm sure most of you saw, Donald Trump announced over the weekend that he believed that because of the theft of the 2020 election that he alleges, that not only should the election be overturned, but the US Constitution ought to be suspended so that the election can be overturned. It's sort of a silly statement. I think rather than dissecting it for its meaning, I think there's two other, more relevant and more interesting questions to consider. Number one is, why did he say it? Or is, what did Trump think he was gaining politically by calling for a suspension of the Constitution? And the only answer I can come up with is that Trump, particularly in the aftermath of his very ill-fated dinner with a couple of white supremacists and anti-Semites at Mar-a-Lago not too long ago, that Trump has begun to believe that his best path back toward political relevancy is not by expanding his base of support, but by motivating the most loyal elements of his base of support to a much greater level. And he believes that those who are angriest at the injustices that he points to would rally to his cause on something like that. The second question, of course, is how do Republicans respond to this? And it's worth noting that while any number of Republican senators have strongly disagreed with the premise of suspending the US Constitution, which is not particularly newsworthy, a number, but not a large number, have criticized Trump personally on this. And the fact that more Republicans, while they're willing to disagree with Trump, but not to harshly criticize him for making such a suggestion, I think is a reminder to us that even while Trump is greatly diminished in terms of political influence within the Republican Party as a result of the midterm elections, he still is the most potent political force within the GOP. The best way I've heard it described is somebody smart and funny wrote, Trump is no longer the 900-pound gorilla of the Republican Party. Maybe now he's the 400-pound gorilla. And so does that mean that he'll be the nominee in 2 years? I don't know. It does appear that Governor DeSantis has been rising and is now past Trump in many national and state polls of Republican voters. But the fact that so many Republican elected officials are drawing a distinction between criticizing Trump's position but not criticizing him means that while some are courageous enough to criticize him directly, many others are still tiptoeing around it in order to sort of split the difference.
So I think we have time for one more question. And this audience member asked, 1 year ago, President Biden signed the $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill into law. When are we going to see results from that bill?
Well, not only did Biden sign the Inflation Reduction Act about a year ago, but that was the final in a series of economic growth measures or government spending measures, if you prefer, that he signed over the course of 2023. And most of those types of projects do take a certain period of time in order to have a direct economic impact. Construction, manufacturing, infrastructure, these types of projects generally take years to develop. But what we already are beginning to see is the Biden administration delivering financial resources to state and local government to begin these projects. So the economic impact of the bill's passage is probably still some ways away. The political impact is closer but mixed. On one hand, Biden is proud that he's been able to Congress to spend this much money on so many various economic growth opportunities. On the other hand, with inflation still raging at unacceptably high rates, you didn't see a lot of Democrats bragging about this on the campaign trail last month because they understood that a lot of voters equated large amounts of government spending with higher than desirable levels of inflation. The economic impact still a little ways off, the political impact sooner, but at least for right now, the political impact is mixed. And one last point, Rachel, before we bring Kim back on, is the Inflation Reduction Act, while it invested a great deal of money in US manufacturing, it also created advantages for US manufacturing over foreign competitors and created barriers for foreign manufacturers to sell their products in the United States. And we've talked on this program many times before about US trade policy, and we don't have time for a full discussion on it now. But with some voters, while with many voters, the idea of investing in the quote unquote buy American provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act is a political benefit. The US is beginning to hear in increasingly vocal ways from our allies in Europe and on the Pacific Rim that shutting them out of US markets is not in the long-term interest of our relationships with those allies. What the Western European countries don't love these provisions, but at least for right now, they're willing not to push too hard because they see the importance of working together to push back against Russia and Ukraine. On the Pacific Rim, though, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, any number of other countries who are longtime allies of the US, letting it be known that it's going to be much more difficult for them to work with us in standing up to China if we don't find a way to open these markets back up. So I know the question was originally about the economic impact of the legislation, but the political impact, both here domestically and internationally, is worth a much longer conversation for one of our next programs. But I guess that will wait until 2023, huh?
It will. Thank you so much, Dan. This was a really great conversation, and as always, appreciate you being here. And yeah, we'll be back in 2023.
Well, Rachel, as always, you are terrific. Thank you for all your help.
And thank you for all your quality programming in 2022. And I know everyone who's on this live stream is looking forward to January 3rd, 2023.